My name is Delaney Goodman.
My name is Drew Brannan.
My name's Jacob Welch.
We are from the Gainesville PDC. The case study that we were assigned for this project is case study 1. We listed the case study here so that you can reference it if you want to look at the characteristics that we pulled out, where we got them from. That went 2 slides. Before we talk about the specific characteristics, we want to talk a little bit about our understanding of each disability. So our primary disability was specific learning disability. According to the APA definition, it includes 4 criteria. The first is that there's a persistence of academic problems in at least one of the 6 areas. These areas include poor spelling, written expression, number sense, mathematical reasoning, and slow or inaccurate reading. The second criteria is that there's a substantial discrepancy between actual and expected academic skills based on chronological age that results in a significant interference with academic, occupational, or daily living skills. The third is that the learning difficulties can begin in middle-aged years, but they might not become evident until task demands increase. These task demands include limited time, tight deadlines, and long reports. The last criteria is that learning difficulties are not due to other disabilities. So these disabilities could include intellectual disabilities, visual or hearing impairment, English language learner, or poor instruction. There are many causes of specific learning disability, but the one that we feel pertains to this case is that several medical conditions can cause learning disabilities. For example, premature birth places children at risk for neurological dysfunction and learning disabilities. Some of the characteristics of the students with specific learning disability includes reading. Reading is one of the greatest difficulties for most students. As we all know, reading affects every other academic subject in school. So if you can't read, then you typically struggle in math and science and histories. Students with the reading disabilities also are likely to experience problems in areas that include phonological awareness, reading fluency, vocabulary, decoding, and reading comprehension. If the students are not good at the basic skills such as decoding or the vocabulary or phonological awareness, they're obviously not going to be able to read with fluency and understand what they're reading. In addition, the ability to read and write are really closely linked. So if a student is unable to read and they exhibit reading disorders, then they also have problems writing most of the time. Many professionals have noted that there are many children that have specific learning disability that display behavioral characteristics. Some of these characteristics include distractibility, hyperactivity, perceptual disturbances, or language problems. In addition, a lot of students that have a specific learning disability, they struggle to use the social uses of language. These are referred to as pragmatics. So students are often unskilled in the production and reception of discourse. They're unable to engage in the mutual give and take that conversations require between individuals. Another thing is that many of them have problems with the mechanical and social uses of language. So they might have trouble with syntax, semantics, and phonology. In addition, they often have difficulty accurately and automatically retrieving information from long-term memory and sometimes short-term memory. And commonly, a lot of the students with specific learning disability, they display learned helplessness, which is a tendency to give up and expect the worst. No matter how hard they try, they assume that they're going to fail. In addition, there's a lot of developmental milestones that children reach. By a certain age, you're supposed to know so many vocabulary words, you're supposed to be able to understand and follow simple directions. Some of the developmental milestones that students might not reach include delay in comprehension or expression of spoken language. So examples of this would be limited receptive vocabulary, reduced expressive vocabulary, so they're late talkers. They might have difficulty understanding simple directions or immature syntax. Another developmental milestone that they might miss is a delay in emergent literacy skills. So they might have minimal interest in print, which we feel pertains to this case study especially. They might have slow speech in naming objects or colors. And they also exhibit problems in perceptual motor skills. So these could be problems in gross or fine motor coordination, difficulty in coloring, copying, and drawing. So many kids that have not reached these developmental milestones when they're supposed to, like on time for like their expected age, they're at risk for learning disabilities. This is something that preschool teachers can look out for, especially since coloring, copying, drawing, following simple directions, all of these things are expected at the age of 4 or 5. And if these kids aren't reaching them, they are at risk for these learning disabilities. Some of the educational considerations, there's many that could be considered, but for this case specifically, we feel that it's important to understand that effective reading instruction includes 5 components. It includes phonological awareness training, phonics instruction, fluency instruction, vocabulary, and comprehension instruction, which our student lacks in all of these. For help with fluency, you should have the student read aloud. The repeated reading is another thing that could work. This is where students repeatedly read the same short passages aloud until they are reading at an appropriate pace with few or no errors. In addition, a lot of students with specific learning disability have testing accommodations. So many of these students receive accommodations on standardized tests. This could include altering scheduling, presentation format, and response format. They also could have extended time in small group setting administration compared to the natural setting that they're in.
Yeah, so to build off what Delaney was saying, speech and language disorders can be broken down into 2 aspects, speech disorders and language disorders. The speech disorder is when a person struggles to produce or use oral language. And this could include things such as voice, improper pacing, incorrect production of speech sounds, and so on. A language disorder is when someone has difficulty expressing themselves or difficulty understanding what others are saying. And one of the most common services provided for a language disorder is speech language therapy. And that's something that we suggested as a accommodation for our student. Language disorders have many aspects, such as listening and speaking, reading and writing, and social interactions. Language disorders are prevalent in many disabilities, including specific learning disabilities. A child with a language disorder may eventually reach many or most of these milestones, but at a later age than their peers. Children often catch up to their peers, but they'll fall behind later in school. So similar to a language disorder, speech disorders have many influencing factors that affect a child's speech. Some of these include phonological awareness, articulation disorders, voice disorders, fluency disorders, and motor speech disorders. Children who have phonological disorders typically struggle to differentiate and produce phonemes. This is often seen in children under the age of 9. Another type of language disorder is an articulation disorder. Articulation disorders is a disorder in which the individual omits, substitutes, or distorts or adds speech sounds. And this is, we believe that Billy, which was our student in our case study, that his primary disability was specific learning disability, and his secondary disability was speech language impairment. We believe Billy's primary disability is specific learning disability because of the following characteristics. He consistently showed problems in poor written expression, poor reading comprehension, and poor spelling. He was also retained in kindergarten because of his behavior and intellectual problems, which continued to 2nd grade. He still does not know his ABCs or how to write his name. So we concluded that he has issues in reading comprehension, reading fluency, spelling, and written expression. His reading issues will carry over to affect his writing issues. Billy often met milestones far behind his classmates. He would often substitute W for L long after other children his age. Although Billy was good at math, his reading trouble began to affect all other content areas. Billy was also becoming easily distracted, which was a behavioral characteristic of SLD. We concluded that a medical condition that might have caused Billy's specific learning disability was his premature birth. The case study stated that he was born prematurely at 34 weeks.
So continuing on to some more causes, along with his lack of ability with his reading and writing, speech was a big one that kept him behind. His impaired speech made it harder to maintain conversations that were appropriate for his level. And this also made it much harder for him to express himself. This was also seen within the case study that even when he was given outside help from his parents, they took him to museums and places to help build his vocabulary, he was still unable to retrieve this. He was unable to retrieve his long-term words to express himself. And through this, he learned helplessness, which is very common for kids that fall behind like this, and for kids that have trouble reading, is that they're so used to failing and not being able to meet standards and expectations that they'll simply give up trying when something, a new challenge is presented. And another problem that he had was that he had little to no interest in reading from a very young age. From when he fell behind, it was discouraging, and he lost interest and would rather play with more tangible items rather than reading in younger ages. And we believe that he started out with a lot of comprehension and articulation issues, and he had a phonological disorder, which really affected him in being unable to be producing smaller sounds, like when he was unable to learn his ABCs. This really started off what kicked him behind in his articulation ability. And so now for the accommodations that help him with his specific learning disability, we would start off with, he continues to see his speech language pathologist and his remedial learning teacher, because as we know, a big issue with him is that if he falls behind, he tends to stay behind or continue falling behind. So we want to keep him with this extra support and not take this away. Something to help his independent learning would be guided notes when he's taking notes independently in class, that we take away the extra fluff around certain vocabulary terms that are important, because that a lot of times can just be a distracting factor if he's trying to take down whole sentences or longer phrases. That we want to be able to narrow down with guided notes exactly what the vocabulary is important in that unit. We don't want to be confusing him with other words. Third accommodation is that since he's had trouble with his phonological awareness, he should just be given extra word work with the teacher, whether this is in times with reading stations or literacy stations when kids are swapping. He could receive extra time with the teacher to do word work. And there could also be pull-out times when other teachers help him as well. But especially when he is in independent or learning centers, it is important that he's having a teacher to help read with him and he's reading aloud, because if not, you can have a situation where he's just independently reading, which is not one of his stronger skills. And if he can't read, he's just going to be wasting his time and become more uninterested with the book and not learning. So once he does become more aware reading with a teacher, some of these texts, however, it is important that we use repeated texts and readings, because he can get more familiar with the vocabulary and more fluent when reading just the same book for maybe a week or two. And when he's testing as well, it's important that he is read aloud most of his answers or all of his answers and questions, and he's given more time in order to process things. As delayment is one of his bigger issues, it's important that he has excess time to complete these things. And since we know that if we give him this test independently, we know the result will be, insufficient and it will be failing. So it's unfair to hold him to these standards. And so the teacher should be reading him the questions and the answers. And even though this won't give a true evaluation of his level on a kindergarten or second grade level of where he's at for his reading, it will at least know that and show growth from where he has started with the class. Another big accommodation we want to give to him is that his expression of himself and his feelings and thoughts are lacking. And so he should have different ways to help him express himself and what he needs. This could be through things like flashcards or signs he holds up with his fingers and hands to help express what he wants rather than having to use words. This could also be something like a drawing board, where if he doesn't exactly know how to articulate what he's thinking or feeling, that he can draw it out. And finally, it is most important when working on helping him express himself that the teacher should never interrupt him or disrupt him, because although it might be slower and it might be painful and the moment might have moved on, it's important that he is able to have that time to work through it himself, regardless of it's appropriate for the time of the class. That if he's making the effort, that he's not feeling discouraged for taking a little longer time than other students would. And then these are our resources where we found all our information from to find the accommodations and reasons for these disabilities.